Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Lobster Thermidor. That's right, I'm very excited to show you my take on this iconic special occasion dish. And not only is this going to look great and taste amazing, it's also going to be easy to eat, which is not always something we can say about your typical lobster recipe. It's almost as if they've developed some kind of evolutionary defense mechanism to help protect them from being consumed. But here, because we're using tails and separating the meat from the shell ahead of time, we're going to end up with something extremely user-friendly that, by the way, only looks hard to make, as you're about to see. And first up, we're going to need to prep our tails before we cook them. And what I have here are four approximately 4-ounce each lobster tails. Although this technique will work the same with any size. And to prep these, what we need to do is take some scissors and cut through that lighter, softer bottom shell right where it attaches on the side to that thicker upper shell. So we will cut from the big end all the way to the tail end, right where those two shells meet, on both sides. And by doing that, once this is cooked, we're going to be able to pull out all the meat in that shell we cut. And then once our lobster meat mixture is prepped, we'll go ahead and stuff that right back into the shell to create what most people think is a pretty impressive presentation. So we'll go ahead and make our 2 cuts on the bottom of each tail, at which point we'll head to the stove to almost cook these all the way, but not quite. And we'll do that in some melted butter over medium-high heat. So we'll go ahead and place those in cut side down. And yes, I'm also tossing in any of those little flippers that came off. And what we'll do is cook this covered for about 5 minutes or so, until, like I said, they're just about all the way cooked through. Okay, don't forget, this is going to get cooked again once our shells are stuffed. So we don't want to overcook them at this stage. So what we'll do is start those cut side down, and then after about 3 minutes, we'll go ahead and uncover those and turn them over to the shell side. Or at least one side of the shell side, because they're kind of curvy. And then once those are turned, we'll recover it, cook that for 1 minute, uncover it, turn those to the other side of the shell, and then go ahead and give those one last minute. At which point, if everything goes according to plan, they should be just about almost cooked through. All right, let's say 85 to 90%. Okay, so to recap, about 3 minutes on the cut side, and then a couple minutes on the shell side. And then once that's set, what we'll want to do is turn off the heat and remove those lobster tails to a bowl, along with any other shell remnants we've added, because we're just about to use this pan to cook our shallots. So once everything's been removed, we'll put the heat back on to medium and add a nice chunk of butter, along with some minced up shallots and a pinch of salt. And what we'll do is cook those stirring for about 3 or 4 minutes until they sort of soften up and turn translucent. And as these cook, the moisture from those shallots should start to deglaze the bottom of the pan of any of those lobster juices that started to caramelize on. And then what we'll do after a few minutes, once our shallots are looking a little something like this, is go ahead and toss in our diced mushrooms, if we're using. These are optional, although I consider them personally mandatory. And we'll go ahead and cook those stirring for about maybe 5 or 6 minutes, until they sort of turn a golden brown. And not only are these mushrooms going to help increase the volume of our stuffing, which of course in the business we call filler, but they're also like flavor sponges, and they're going to absorb all that caramelized lobster flavor from the pan. And since once cooked they have a similar texture, it's going to seem like you actually have more lobster than you do. So like I said, we'll go ahead and cook those until they're sort of golden and looking something like this, at which point we're going to toss in about a tablespoon of flour. And we'll go ahead and stir that in until the mushrooms are coated. And then we'll cook this for an additional 2 minutes to take the raw tasting edge off that starch. And don't be surprised if some of that flour starts to stick to the bottom of the pan. Totally normal. And not a bad thing. Because what we're going to do after cooking the flour for a couple minutes is deglaze with a splash of cognac. Or if times are tough, just some brandy. And what we'll do is pour that in, and then ignite it with this lighter to burn off all the alcohol. Which it would have done anyway, but if people are watching, that's kind of fun to do. People seem to like explosions. But anyway, we're going to flambe with some cognac. And as soon as that liquor disappears, which is only going to take a few seconds, we will quickly pour in some cold milk and give everything a stir. And then what's going to happen is this comes back up to temperature is a couple things. Okay, any and all goodness left on the bottom of the pan should be fully dissolved. And also, once this mixture gets hot enough to start simmering, you'll notice it should thicken up nicely. And as with all sauces that are thickened with flour, once it does start boiling, that's as thick as it's going to get. And if it's too thick, you could always thin out with a little more milk. But this one looked just about perfect. And then what we'll do once that's thickened up and is bubbling is go ahead and turn off the heat and stir in a couple tablespoons of creme fraiche. Or if you prefer, some heavy cream, with maybe a little squeeze of lemon to mimic the acidity from the creme fraiche. And what we'll do is just stir that in, and then with the heat off, we'll just let this cool a little bit while we move on to finish prepping our tails, which should be cool enough to handle by now. And what we'll do is attempt to pull that meat out of the shell by sticking our thumb underneath like this, although it's probably easier if we take that center shell off first. And be careful, do not waste any scraps of meat. Okay, if there's any meat attached to the shell, pull it off and reserve it. And hopefully by getting your finger under like this, most of that meat's going to come off in one section. And that is pretty much this entire step. Okay, we're removing meat from shell and shell from meat. And by the way, if you have trouble peeling that meat away from the shell with your finger, sometimes you just need to start it by scraping with a spoon, and then it should come off. But anyway, do what you gotta do. And hopefully you'll end up with a nice pile of meat like this. And of course, 4 empty, now ready to use shells, which we'll go ahead and transfer onto a sheet pan, on top of some crinkled up foil that I formed some channels to hold the shells in place. And then we'll move back to the cutting board to cut up our tail meat into some bite-sized pieces. And as we slice these in half, you always want to check to see if these need to be deveined. And these really didn't have too much, although there were a few little pieces I'm going to remove. Okay, so just like when you're cleaning shrimp, if you see any pieces of what we call the vein, go ahead and pull that out, since that can be a little bit gritty. But other than a few little pieces, mine were relatively clean. And then once we've checked for that, we'll go ahead and cut this up into like 1/2-inch pieces. And once our lobster meat's been cut up, we'll go ahead and add it to a bowl. And we'll go ahead and transfer in our sauce, which is now slightly cooled and appearing much thicker. But don't worry, it's going to thin out when it's hot. And then we'll finish this up with a pinch of salt, and also more than a couple shakes of cayenne. And then last but not least, a generous application of freshly chopped tarragon, which I believe to be the ultimate lobster herb. And we'll go ahead and take a spoon and mix this all together. And by the way, feel free to customize this filling to your liking. I mean, you are, after all, the dinosaur of your Lobster Thermidor. And back in Dinah's day, they would have added things like mustard and egg yolks and Gruyere cheese. Right, back then, this would have been a much richer dish. But in my opinion, if this mixture is too rich, you're sort of hiding that beautiful lobster, which is what I want to be the star of the show. So suit yourself, and we'll talk about that on the blog post. But I like to stay with a relatively light approach. And then once that's mixed up, we'll go ahead and stuff that evenly into our 4 shells, which I highly recommend doing over the bowl, not over the foil, since if you drop some, it's really annoying to pick up off the foil. And then once we have that mixture divvied up as evenly as we can, we will finish these off by sprinkling over the following 3 things. First, a tiny bit of dry breadcrumb. All right, just a little touch, maybe 1/2 teaspoon per tail, followed by an equally light application of freshly grated Parmesan. Okay, just a little dusting. And then last but not least, because this is a French dish after all, we will drizzle over a little bit of melted butter. And that's it. Once that's been applied, these are finally ready to roast, which we'll do in the center of a 450-degree oven for about 10 minutes or so, or until nicely browned, and our meat is heated through. And if you want, and I usually do, I'll finish them for about a minute under the broiler, so as to get some nice color on the surface. And when they're done, they should hopefully look something like this, which I think is just absolutely beautiful. And at this point, you'll be happy to know we do not have to let these rest. In fact, don't. We'll go ahead and serve those up immediately, possibly next to a nice salad, or one of these prop salads that looks like a real salad. And not only does this look visually impressive and like it was super hard to make, but your guests have to do virtually no work getting this on a fork and up to their mouth. But just being easy to eat wouldn't really matter if this wasn't also intensely delicious. In fact, this was so delicious, I totally forgot you're not supposed to push food onto your fork with your finger. So please excuse my atrocious table manners. And I switched and tried to do it with a spoon and fork. But that didn't feel right, so I went back to the finger. And I know I said I used a relatively light approach here, which I did, but this is still relatively rich and decadent. And we have just enough of that creamy sauce coating the lobster without overpowering it and covering it up. So I just absolutely loved how this came out. But anyway, that's it. My take on Lobster Thermidor. When it comes to extravagant, expensive, special occasion recipe ideas, this one is one of my favorites. And just between you and me, because we're using frozen lobster tails, They're not even really that expensive to make. So for all those reasons and more, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.